We stand at the dawn of a new era for cannabis. Finally, in the 21st century, medicinal cannabis is being rediscovered by physicians and patients alike. In this first part of our presentation, we'll look at medicinal use in the context of the 5,000-year history of cannabis. This includes cannabis use in ancient times, in patent medicines, and its use in the early 20th century. In the second part of our presentation, we will discuss what we know about cannabis by way of research, studies, and commissioned hearings. In the third part, we'll discuss the current laws surrounding cannabis here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in the United States. Cannabis sativa is one of the oldest agricultural crops known to man, cultivated as early as 6000 BC in China. It is grown all over the world and has been valued for its medicinal benefits, its fiber properties, and as a food source. Some of the first recorded uses of cannabis are cannabis seeds for food in China, 6000 BC. 4000 BC, we begin to see textiles made of cannabis that are used in China. Remains have been found of the cannabis fiber from this period. In 2727 BC, we see the first recorded use of cannabis as medicine in Chinese pharmacopoeia of Shen Nung, one of the fathers of Chinese medicine. The mystical emperor Shen Nung of China was prescribing cannabis tea for the treatment of gout, rheumatism, malaria, and oddly enough, poor memory. In 550 BC, the Persian prophet Zoroaster gives cannabis first place in the sacred text, the Zendavesta, which listed over 10,000 medicinal plants. 100 BC, we see the Chinese make paper from cannabis and mulberry. So here we see the first psychotropic properties of cannabis mentioned in the newly compiled Herbal Pensao. In 70 AD, Roman Emperor Nero's surgeon Dioscorides praises cannabis in the first Materia Medica. By 600 AD, the Germans, the Franks, and the Vikings were all making paper from cannabis. The drug's popularity as a medicine had spread throughout Asia, the Middle East, and down the eastern coast of Africa, where certain Hindu sects in India used cannabis for religious purposes and stress relief. In 1563, Queen Elizabeth I decreed that landowners with 60 acres or more must grow cannabis or face a 5-pound fine. In 1564, King Philip of Spain followed the lead of Queen Elizabeth and ordered cannabis to be grown throughout his empire, from modern-day Argentina to Oregon. All of the European powers with settlements in the New World were particularly interested in growing cannabis, and laws were made stipulating the recipients of land grants in the new colonies must devote a portion of their land and labor to growing it. All trade depended on it, and all naval military strategy was equally reliant on a steady and secure supply of cannabis. In 1753, cannabis sativa, classified by Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus published a system for classifying living things, which has been developed into the modern classification system we use today. In 1783, cannabis indica was classified by Lamarck, a French classification scientist. By the late 18th century, early editions of American medical journals recommended cannabis seeds and roots for the treatment of inflamed skin, incontinence, and venereal disease. Irish Dr. William O'Shaughnessy first popularized cannabis's medical use in England and America. As a physician with the British East India Company, he found cannabis eased the pain of rheumatism and was helpful against the discomfort and nausea in cases of rabies, cholera, and tetanus. In 1857, Smith Brothers of Edinburgh started to market a highly active extract of cannabis indica used as a basis for innumerable tinctures. 1850, cannabis is listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia as a medicine for various ailments. The 1854 United States Dispensary said this about cannabis: extract of hemp acts as a decided aphrodisiac, increases the appetite, and occasionally induces the cataleptic state. In morbid states, it is found to produce sleep, to allay spasm, to compose nervous inquietude, and to relieve pain. In these respects, it resembles opium in its operation, but differs from that narcotic in not diminishing the appetite, checking the secretions, or constipating the bowels. It is much less certain in its effects, but may sometimes be preferably employed when opium is contraindicated by its nauseating or constipating effects. The complaints to which it has been specially recommended are neuralgia, gout, tetanus, epidemic cholera, convulsions, chorea, hysteria, mental depression, insanity, and uterine hemorrhage. In 1860, the first governmental commissioned study of cannabis and health was conducted by the Ohio State Medical Society. In 1890, Queen Victoria's personal physician, Sir Russell Reynolds, prescribed cannabis for menstrual cramps. He claimed in the first issue of The Lancet that cannabis, when pure and administered carefully, is one of the most valuable medicines we possess. In 1895, the Indian Hemp Drug Commission, an 1893 study of cannabis use in India, concluded that cannabis has medical uses, no addictive properties, and a number of positive emotional and social benefits. The sea of change in American attitudes towards cannabis came at the end of the 19th century, when between 2% and 5% of the population was unknowingly addicted to morphine, a popular secret ingredient in patent medicines with colorful names like the People's Healing Liniment for Man or Beast and Dr. Fenner's Golden Relief. Toward the end of the 19th century, the development of synthetic drugs such as aspirin, chlorohydrate, and barbiturates, which at the time were chemically more stable than cannabis indica and therefore more reliable, hastened the decline of cannabis as a medicine. But the new drugs had striking disadvantages. More than 1,000 people died each year from aspirin-induced bleeding in the United States, and the barbiturates were far more dangerous, with a high number of deaths caused by the drugs. To prevent more of the country from being washed over with a morphine-induced golden relief, the government introduced the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, whereby creating the Food and Drug Administration. It didn't apply to cannabis and merely brought the distribution of opium and morphine under doctors' control. The regulation of chemical substances was a major shift in American drug policy. It was during the early decades of the 1900s we begin to see individual cities, locales, and states implementing prohibition of opiates and cannabis as a means to discriminate lower social classes and immigrants. There is overwhelming documentation relating drug use to violent and bizarre actions by the Mexicans, the Chinese, Native Americans, and post-Civil War slaves. These types of stories are found in many early publications, like the one we have here from the Florida Star, dated May 19, 1905. Cannabis use is very familiar in the border towns of Texas and New Mexico, so it is here that Mexican use is first reported. First to note the use of the drug were El Paso law enforcement officials, who quickly secured a local ordinance in 1914 banning sale and possession of the drug. El Paso officials and local representatives of custom and agricultural departments of the federal government agitated state and federal legislation to combat the killer weed. It is also during this time that newspaper tycoon Randolph Hearst has 800,000 acres of prime Mexican timberland seized from him by Pancho Villa and his men. In 1916, recognizing that timber supplies are finite, the USDA issues Bulletin Number 404, calling for a new program of expansion of cannabis to replace uses of timber by industry. In 1916, a process was invented that turned the herds, or woody pith from cannabis, into paper. In 1917, a decoritator was invented by George Slickton that could break the plant down into herds and good fiber. It is at this point that cannabis begins making its exit from agricultural land. In the meantime, by 1918, U.S. pharmaceutical farms grow 60,000 pounds of cannabis annually. However, cannabis begins to be prohibited for non-medical use in the U.S., especially in the Southwest states. In June 1925, the governor of the Panama Canal commissioned a study into the use and effect of smoking marijuana on military personnel with a view to securing additional evidence that might possibly be used as the basis for forming regulations forbidding the cultivation, possession, or sale of cannabis in the Canal Zone. We also begin to see various forms of media and governmental discouragement of the use of cannabis, describing it as a killer drug that will incite insanity upon even your first exposure. By the mid-1930s, Hearst's sensational anti-marijuana stories leads to the outcry for cannabis prohibition throughout the U.S. In 1930, Harry Anslinger was appointed head of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a subsidiary under the U.S. Treasury Department. It is important to note that the Secretary of Treasury at that time was Harry's wife's uncle, Andrew Mellon, of Mellon Bank. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics stated that during the 1930s, they had an increase of reports of people smoking marijuana. It is then that H.R. 6385, the Marijuana Tax Act, was proposed. Congressional hearings were held about the harms of marijuana. Despite the findings of the 1894 Indian hemp cannabis study, the 1925 Panama Canal Zone report, the fact that cannabis was the third most common ingredient in patent medicines, and regardless of the USDA Bulletin 404 declaring cannabis an important agricultural product for our country's resources, Harry Anslinger maintained that, quote, marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death, end quote. In 1930, Dr. William Woodward, the American Medical Association chief lobbyist, both a doctor and a lawyer, testified before the House Ways and Means Committee that the AMA knows of no dangers in the use of cannabis. At the time, it had been in the U.S. pharmacopoeia for over 75 years and was found in 28 patent medicines. The American Medical Association opposed the act because the tax was imposed on physicians prescribing cannabis, retail pharmacists selling cannabis, and medical cannabis cultivation and manufacturing. The AMA not only made it clear that it thought the act should not be passed, they also strongly urged that if the legislation did pass, it should not be called the Marijuana Tax Act. This was because in those days, no one in the medical profession used the term marijuana. It had always been referred to as cannabis. The AMA proposed that cannabis instead be added to the already existing Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. The bill was passed over the last-minute objections of the American Medical Association, and this placed a tax on the sale of cannabis. The birdseed industry successfully lobbied to the committee, resulting in an exemption for specially treated seeds. This is the reason cannabis hemp products imported from outside the USA are allowed to be used in food products today. During that same year, 1937, DuPont patented a process for making chemical plastics from oil and coal. He also processed the patent on nylon. He made a new bleaching process for making paper from wood pulp. And DuPont advised his shareholders to invest in the new petrochemical industry, claiming that the government would force the acceptance of these new industries. 1938 February, Popular Mechanics magazine declared hemp the new billion-dollar crop. The article had been written before the Tax Act had passed. In 1941, Popular Mechanics magazine revealed the details of Henry Ford's plastic car made using cannabis hemp and fueled from cannabis oil. Henry Ford continued to illegally grow cannabis for some years after the federal ban. In one article it says, "Here is the auto Henry Ford grew from the soil. Its plastic panels with impact strength 10 times greater than steel were made from flax, wheat, hemp, and spruce pulp." The Popular Mechanics 1941 text said, "After 12 years of research, the Ford Motor Company has completed an experimental automobile with a plastic body. Its design takes advantages of the properties of plastic, but the streamlined car does not differ greatly in appearance from its steel counterpart." It is during 1941 that cannabis is dropped from the American pharmacopoeia, and cannabis is declared to have no medicinal redeeming importance by the chief of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. By 1942, with the implementation of the Marijuana Tax Act, cannabis fiber production had all but ceased to exist. The Hemp for Victory campaign began during World War II, was made to encourage farmers to grow hemp for the war effort because other industrial fibers, often imported from overseas, were in short supply. The film shows a history of hemp and hemp products, how hemp is grown, how hemp is processed into rope, cloth, cordage, and other products. This event was short-lived, for after the war was over, the movement was abandoned and the Tax Act once again applied, making cannabis use non-existent. So what happened to the science, the research, and the medical applications of cannabis after the Marijuana Tax Act? We didn't hear from Henry Ford anymore about his plastic vehicle parts made from plant material. A chemical process had been patented to do this. Cannabis herds were not used for paper. There was a chemical process to do this also. Cannabis was not considered for energy to replace coal or extracted oil, even though its plant material made fuel for Henry Ford's first Model T. Let's review some of the studies, the published reports, and the findings of numerous commissions about the use and effects of cannabis. Despite the U.S. government's nearly century-long prohibition of the plant, cannabis is one of the most investigated, therapeutically active substances in history. To date, there are over 20,000 published studies or reviews in the scientific literature referencing the cannabis plant and its cannabinoids, nearly one-third of which were published in the last 5 years. According to a keyword search on PubMed Central, the U.S. government repository for peer-reviewed scientific research, there were over 1,450 peer-reviewed papers published in 2013 alone. By contrast, a keyword search of hydrocodone, a commonly prescribed painkiller, yields just over 600 total references in the entire body of available scientific literature. Studies have revealed that the cannabis plant contains in excess of 60 active compounds that likely possess distinctive therapeutic properties. Prior to its removal from the pharmacopoeia in 1942, studies had been being done since the late 19th century. The first plant cannabinoid or the phytocannabinoid, cannabinol CBN, was isolated from a red oil extract of cannabis in the late 19th century. This structure was further elucidated in the early 1930s by R.S. Kahn. Its chemical synthesis was first achieved in 1940 in the laboratories of R. Adams in the USA and Lord Todd in the UK. A second phytocannabinoid, cannabidiol, CBD, was first obtained from cannabis in 1940 by Adams and his colleagues. While THCs were first extracted from cannabis in 1942 by Woolner, Matchett, Levine, and Lowe. In 1938, LaGuardia, mayor of New York City, assigned the New York Academy of Medicine to investigate the premises of marijuana prohibition. A blue ribbon committee of 31 scientists was assembled. Physicians from the City Department of Hospitals supervised clinical research involving 77 patients. A sociological study on the extent of use by New Yorkers was conducted by a police department team. The LaGuardia Marijuana Report refutes the claims made by Hurst and Anslinger and reports that cannabis causes no violence at all and cites other positive results. Anslinger responded by denouncing LaGuardia and threatened doctors with prison sentences if they carried out independent research on cannabis. A key chapter of the report by Dr. Samuel Allentuck and Carl Bowman, The Psychiatric Aspects of Marijuana Intoxication, was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in September 1942. It specifically refuted the Federal Bureau of Narcotics' characterization of marijuana as an addictive drug that led to insanity. Some of the research done on behalf of the LaGuardia Report resulted in the early pharmacological experiments with single cannabinoids and were performed in the 1940s, reviewed again in 1944 by Lowe. One study done at the Department of Pharmacology of Cornell Medical School, collaborated by Dr. Modell and Dr. Roger Adams, professor of chemistry at the University of Illinois. Dr. Woolner was the consulting chemist of the United States Treasury Department who supplied some of the cannabis which was used in the study. The results of their clinical animal tests provided early evidence that CBN had much lower potency than THC as a psychotropic agent, and that CBD lacked psychotropic activity altogether. An even earlier experiment, carried out by Hagen Smith in 1940, concluded the same findings. Another finding made at this time was that sleep induced in mice by an unnamed barbiturate could be prolonged by adding CBD, although not by higher doses of CBN or THC. Where cannabis and epilepsy are concerned, we know that during the 19th century, several medical reports were published on the improved effects cannabis extracts had on several forms of convulsions. We see it in O'Shaughnessy, 1842, Shaw, 1843, Sinkler, 1878, Gowers, 1881, and Reynolds, 1890. Then, in 1947, the anti-epileptic properties of cannabis were studied once again, only this time it was conducted on children. Dr. Gene Davis and Dr. H. Ramsey conducted a study on 5 institutionalized children whose seizures had failed to be controlled by phenobarbital, dilantin, and mesantoin. These 3 drugs are still used today to try and control seizure disorder. The study found that 3 responded at least as well as to previous therapy. The 4th became almost completely, and the 5th entirely seizure-free. Except for a brief period of paranoid behavior in one patient 3.5 weeks later, no other psychic disturbances or toxic reactions were manifested during the periods of treatment. All of the blood counts were normal. The study concluded that the cannabinoids herein reported deserve further trial in non-institutionalized epileptics. In 1945, Newsweek reported that over 100,000 Americans used cannabis. In 1951, the United Nations Bulletin of Narcotic Drugs estimated that there were 200 million cannabis users worldwide. It is also during that same year Congress passed the Boggs Act, which for the first time included cannabis with narcotic drugs. In 1961, Harry Anslinger headed the U.S. delegations at the UN Drug Conference, where new international restrictions were placed on cannabis, aiming to eliminate its use worldwide within 25 years. In 1962, Anslinger was forced into retirement by President John F. Kennedy. In 1970, the Marijuana Tax Act is deemed unconstitutional. In 1970, the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, cannabis was classified as a Schedule I drug. Drugs in this category are distinguished as having no accepted medicinal use. This classification asserts by statute that cannabis is equally as dangerous to the public as heroin, defines cannabis and its dozens of distinct cannabinoids as possessing a high potential for abuse and no current accepted medical use, with a lack of accepted safety for the use of the drug under medical supervision. By contrast, cocaine and methamphetamine, which remained illicit for recreational use, but was allowed to be consumed under a doctor's supervision, are classified as Schedule II drugs. Examples of Schedule III and IV include anabolic steroids and Valium, respectively, while codeine containing analgesics are defined by law as a Schedule V drug, the federal government's most lenient classification. Numerous studies on the anti-epileptic performance of the various cannabis properties have been carried out over the 66 years since that 1947 study. However, most of those studies reverted to animal modes of epilepsy, including models of grand mal, corticofocal, and complex partial seizures. Studies have even found cannabinoids to perform well when compared with standard anti-epileptic treatments. One of these studies was published in 1976 and compared the anticonvulsant effects of CBD, CBN, and THC with 7 of the most common anti-epileptic drugs of the time, most of which are still prescribed today. The results showed that CBD was about as effective as 2 of the drugs and even more effective than 3 others. Interestingly, THC and CBN performed slightly worse than CBD, although both were still effective in most cases. The results also showed that CBD could interact with other anti-epileptics by enhancing or diminishing their effect depending on the drug. In spite of the differences observed in the 1976 study between the different cannabinoids, other animal studies have also found crude extracts of cannabis to have strong anti-epileptic effects. For example, a study published in 1978, Anticonvulsant Action of Cannabis in the Rat, found that 200 milligrams per kilo doses of cannabis resin at 17% THC was 100% effective in stopping seizures, whereas 50 milligrams per kilo doses seemed to have no effect. Despite overwhelming support from researchers for human studies to be conducted, cannabis has never been tested on patients with epilepsy in the United States. However, a study was published in 1981 by researchers from Brazil who conducted a randomized placebo-controlled trial on 15 patients suffering from secondary generalized epilepsy. The patients were selected based on a lack of response to traditional treatments. 8 patients were given 200 to 300 milligrams of CBD in addition to their usual anticonvulsant drug, while the others received a placebo. By the end of the study, 4 out of the 8 patients that received CBD became seizure-free. 3 others showed vast improvements. In contrast, only 1 of the 7 patients that received placebo showed measurable improvements. Despite all the research that has shown minuscule negative effects and all the potential positive non-toxic results, there is a systemic denial of the safety and efficacy of cannabis therapy where epilepsy treatment is concerned. During the 1970s, after cannabis was added to the Controlled Substances Act, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA, was charged with future studies and sole control of any cannabis used in medical research. This directly conflicted with any research science of the medicinal value of cannabis, since NIDA's sole mission was to apply science only in an effort to more fully understand drug abuse and addiction. Researchers and drug companies are required to seek FDA approval to begin clinical research. Even though the FDA may approve a study to take place, researchers using cannabis must additionally seek approval from NIDA in order to purchase medical-grade cannabis from the sole provider of research cannabis, the University of Mississippi. NIDA's monopoly deters potential privately funded researchers because financial sponsors will not invest millions of dollars in clinical research until there is reliable access to a supply of cannabis that can be used both in research and, if it resulted in FDA approval, as a prescription medicine. In 2010, a spokesman for NIDA told the New York Times, quote, "As the National Institute on Drug Abuse, our focus is primarily on the negative consequences of marijuana use. We generally do not fund research focused on the potential beneficial medical effects of marijuana." End quote. Research utilizing cannabis was allowed until 1978, despite its designation as having no medicinal use. However, cannabis was distributed from this point to patients by the U.S. government on a case-by-case basis under the Compassionate Use Investigational New Drug Program, established in 1978. Distribution of cannabis through this program was discontinued in 1992. Dr. Mason, head of the United States Public Health Service at the time, is quoted as saying, "If it's perceived that the Public Health Service is going around giving marijuana to folks, there would be a perception that this stuff can't be so bad. It gives a bad signal." There are 4 remaining patients who receive monthly medical cannabis from the IND program. It is important to note that one government agency was investigating the use of cannabis in cancer patients, not as a cure for cancer, but as a palliative treatment for reducing nausea and stimulating appetite. In 1985, the National Cancer Institute, a government agency, sold the patent for what is now known as Marinol to Unimed in order to produce the artificial cannabinoid THC pill. Marinol was approved by the FDA as a treatment for nausea and wasting syndrome in cancer and AIDS patients, which directly conflicts their own statement that there is no medicinal use of cannabis. When Mushalem and his colleagues isolated THC in 1964, they made it possible to further understand the complex nature of the endocannabinoid system. In 1988, cannabinoid binding sites in rat brains were identified. In 1991, human cannabinoid receptor CB1 was successfully cloned. In 1992, the discovery of the first endocannabinoid, anandamide, a Sanskrit word for internal bliss. In 1993, peripheral CB2 receptor was cloned. In 1995, the discovery of a second endocannabinoid, 2-AG, arachidinoglycerol. Further years of collaborative research have showed cannabis compounds activate specific receptors in the brain just as similar chemicals in the body do. These compounds work with the receptors, protect against many symptoms and conditions, including its anti-seizure properties, nausea control, appetite stimulation, and easing pain. Worldwide research has been conducted since the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. It is now found to exist in all mammals and has produced astounding findings that cannot continue to be ignored by state and federal government. The global war on drugs has failed. Not only has it stifled meaningful examination and research about potential medical benefits, it has generated extraordinary levels of violence, crime, and corruption while failing to reduce the availability and use of illegal drugs. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, 1.53 million people were arrested in 2011 alone on nonviolent drug charges. The number of Americans incarcerated in 2011 in federal, state, and local prisons and jails was 2.266 million, or 1 in every 99.1 adults, the highest incarceration rate in the world. There are currently 20 states